terrorized by these cartels, too, extorted, and they fight corruption. Sadly, this has been the case for decades, and there's much uncertainty surrounding Mexico's security policy and the effectiveness of security assistance. It's not for anything that they have something called express kidnappings in Mexico. Despite the efforts of previous Mexican administrations to combat the cartels and address security, 2019 saw a 30% increase in Mexico's homicide rate, much of it driven by drug-related crime. Further, the cartels are constantly evolving and have expanded their drug trade to supply the surge in U.S. demand for methamphetamine, heroin, and synthetic opioids. I recommend the book Dreamland if you're interested in reading more about opioids, heroin, and the Nayarit cartel. Further, we must acknowledge that the flow of illegal weapons from the United States to Mexico is contributing to the violence. This is just but one component. Security challenges, systemic corruption, impunity, and economic challenges are also driving violence in Mexico. Since 2000, the United States has provided roughly $3 billion in security assistance for Mexico under the Merida Initiative. From 2014 to 2018, U.S. security assistance has focused on rule of law, anti-corruption, and human rights in Mexico. However, under the Trump administration, an increased focus has been placed on attacking the business model of Mexican cartels and on combating the increased trade in opioids and synthetic drugs. This is a positive and necessary step. Yet there's much more that needs to be done, but in doing so requires that the United States assistance complement Mexico's security infrastructure and ensure that U.S. priorities are addressed. Mexican President Manuel López Obrador has taken steps to streamline Mexico's security forces and has created a new National Guard which is focused on security and is expected to reach 92,000 troops. This force has also supported immigration enforcement, a welcome development given the crisis at our southern border. President López Obrador has also prioritized anti-corruption and human rights, but the recent surge in violence and increased homicide rate raise questions about the government's real commitment to dealing with these challenges. It's critical that the Mexican government clearly communicate the steps which are being taken to address these problems and present a comprehensive security strategy. For its part, the United States should explore ways to modernize security assistance under Merida and recognize the areas where it has been ineffective. Continued intelligence sharing, capacity building, the provision of technology and equipment are all critical. We should also review our coordination on border security and where we can support Mexico's efforts to carry out inspections and screenings at the border checkpoints. The U.S. Mexico security relationship has come a long way, but we must continue to build that relationship on a foundation of trust and cooperation. It's a joint responsibility which will serve the interests of both of our countries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you very much, Ranking Member Rooney. I will now introduce Dr. David Shirk, Professor of Political Science and Graduate Director for the Masters in International Relations Programs at the University of San Diego. Dr. Shirk's research focuses on U.S. Mexico relations and border politics. He is the principal investigator for the Justice in Mexico project, which analyzes the trends and challenges related to crime, violence, and justice sector reform. Dr. Shirk, we welcome you to the hearing.
Thank you so much.
I need to do the other. I just want to introduce the other two members.
I'm so sorry.
We will then hear from Ms. Maureen Meyer, Director for Mexico and Migrant Rights at the Washington Office on Latin America. Ms. Meyer analyzes U.S.-Mexico security policies and their relations to organized crime, corruption, and human rights violation in Mexico. Ms. Meyer is a member of the Mexican-based Collective for Analysis of Security with Democracy and previously worked for 5 years in Mexico City with the Miguel Agustín Pro Juárez Human Rights Center. Ms. Meyer, thank you for joining us. Finally, we will hear from Mr. Richard Miles, a senior associate of the American program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Miles has 20 years of experience as State Department Foreign Service officer and as an intelligence officer with the U.S. Army. He was the alternate representative to the Organization of American States and advisor on Western Hemisphere affairs to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs and Director for Mexican and Canadian issues on the National Security Council for staff. Mr. Miles, thank you for being here and joining us today. We will now hear from our witnesses. Please keep your remarks to 5 minutes. And Dr. Shirk, we'll begin.
Thank you, Chairman Sires. Thank you, Ranking Member Rooney, and thank you to all the honorable members of the committee for your invitation to be here today and for your attention to this vital issue. I have been working on this issue for nearly 2 decades, and I am also deeply worried and saddened by the evident worsening of conditions in Mexico. As the chairman mentioned, Mexico's experienced elevated levels of violent crime for more than a decade, and while final figures are still being tabulated by Mexico's security agencies, the number of homicide cases reported for 2019 increased to a record 34,000 victims reported by the National Public Security System for 2019, which is an increase from the over 33,000 victims reported in 2018 and over 28,000 reported in 2017, all record years. While clearly appalling, such aggregate statistics do not quite capture the picture, as well as each individual case, as we saw, unfortunately, on November 4th, 2019, with the killing of 3 women and 6 children with dual U.S. Mexican citizenship in 2 ambush attacks by an organized crime group in northern Mexico. The victims ranged in age from 8 months to 43 years. As the chairman mentioned, it is illustrative of the horrific nature of the violence that is pervasive and daily, with an estimated 1 murder every 15 minutes in Mexico in 2019. There are numerous and complex factors that have contributed to this violence, including chronic, macro-level systemic issues, some of which have been mentioned, lack of economic opportunities, lack of education, social problems like domestic violence and substance abuse. Unfortunately, these larger systemic problems, while important, do not readily explain the sharp variations and increases in the level of violence from month to month or from place to place. And we need to look at more recent developments and changes to understand the violence of the past few years. One important change are the market shifts and innovations in the production of illicit goods, including the distribution of methamphetamine and fentanyl, as mentioned by Ranking Member Rooney. We also, unfortunately, have seen the policy of targeting high-level criminal leaders for arrest through the strategy known as the kingpin strategy, having unintended consequences of contributing to the cycle of splintering, diversification, competition, and violence among criminal organizations. We also must recognize that the recent governmental transition in Mexico has had disruptive effects. In 2018, there were an unprecedented number of Mexican federal, state, and local offices up for grabs, resulting in the largest turnover in public office in modern Mexican history. With all these factors in mind, it's clear that Mexico needs the continued support and cooperation of the United States, which, as the chairman mentioned, has a shared responsibility to help address these issues. I make several recommendations in my written testimony, so I'll just point to a few in the minute or so that I have remaining. One is, I think, the clear need to assist Mexico in developing better, long-term, comprehensive criminal investigations to ensure successful prosecutions targeting not only drug kingpins, but all levels and branches of criminal enterprises, including corrupt politicians and private sector money laundering operations. A second one that has also been mentioned, of course, is the need to strengthen controls to prevent illegal exports of firearms to Mexico, but also the seepage of firearms from Mexico's law enforcement and military institutions into usage by organized crime groups. I also, in my written testimony, point to the need for better controls on money laundering and drug trafficking and other organized crime group financial operations, as well as the need to prevent blowback from the elevated numbers of U.S. deportations of criminal aliens to Mexico. I believe that the U.S. government should work more closely with our foreign counterparts to prevent repatriated criminal aliens from becoming new recruits for organized crime in Mexico and Central America. Finally, I will point to the need to really evaluate what's happening in drug policy here in the United States and around the world through independent assessment to evaluate the fiscal and social impacts of drug decriminalization and legalization. As we've seen with Congressman Engel's Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Advisory Group, it's urgent that we consider what's going on with the changing markets for drugs. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Ms. Myers, we will now hear from you.
Chairman Sears, Ranking Member Rooney, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Washington Office on Latin America on ways to strengthen security and the rule of law in Mexico. I'm submitting my written testimony for the record and will summarize key points here. Mexico is undergoing unprecedented levels of violence. 2019 will surpass 2018's record number of homicides, and human rights violations also remain widespread. From 2006 to 2019, the Mexican government registered over 60,000 cases of disappeared people. Uncontrolled corruption and widespread impunity are important drivers of violence in Mexico. The challenges are great. Due to low public trust in public institutions, less than 10% of crimes are reported or investigated in the country. While Mexico's previous two presidential administrations have taken steps to combat these challenges, justice institutions remain weak. Through continued engagement with Mexico, the United States can be a partner in strengthening the rule of law. I'll outline how in my testimony. But first, I want to touch on the measures adopted by the Mexican government. The first measure is criminal justice reforms. In 2008, the Mexican Congress approved sweeping constitutional reforms to adopt an adversarial criminal justice system based on oral trials in public courtrooms, designed to make the system more efficient, transparent, and with due process guarantees. While many challenges remain, including a backlog of cases and the need to train and specialize more personnel, multiple Mexican states have made important advances in implementing the reforms. The second measure is the autonomy of Mexico's justice institutions. In the past, the Mexican executive branch has blocked important investigations into corruption and human rights violations. In 2014, Mexico's Congress passed constitutional reforms to replace the country's Attorney General's office with an autonomous National Prosecutor's Office independent from the executive branch. However, autonomy alone will not make the new institution more effective. This will also depend on the actions taken by the first national prosecutor, named last year, Alejandro Gertz. In the coming year, the priorities he lays out for criminal prosecutions and the transition, as well as his engagement with civil society organizations and victims, will be important indicators of whether Mexico is responding to the longstanding demands for justice. The third is to curtail government collusion with criminal organizations. In far too many cases, Mexican government officials and security agents work in collusion with criminal networks. To name two important examples, the U.S. Department of Justice recently indicted Genaro Garcia Luna, a former public security minister, for allegedly colluding with the Sinaloa cartel. And in the emblematic case of the 43 forcibly disappeared students from Ayotzinapa, the local police officers who detained the students were working on behalf of an organized criminal organization. President López Obrador has made combating corruption a center point of his government, and Gertz Manero is moving forward in select high-profile cases. However, tackling corruption will require more than just a few successful prosecutions. His government should also demonstrate a firm commitment to Mexico's national anti-corruption system, which is a mechanism established in 2016 to coordinate all of anti-corruption efforts at all levels of government in the areas of prevention, investigation, and sanction. While Mexico must build professional police forces with strong accountability mechanisms and remove the military from public security, an effective criminal justice system is paramount to addressing violence and corruption in the country. Detaining more drug traffickers or corrupt officials will be ineffective unless the judiciary can prosecute them while guaranteeing due process. U.S. assistance has already contributed to improvements in the criminal justice system. USAID's Rule of Law projects have helped state attorney generals' offices and courts develop capacity, improve victims' access to justice, and investigate crimes against journalists and human rights defenders. The Department of Justice's OPDAT has trained justice sector personnel on the adversarial system and has collaborated with the Mexican government in drafting relevant legislation. Moving forward, we need to ensure that U.S. agencies involved in justice reform coordinate their efforts and measure the impact of U.S. training. We engage with Mexico so that U.S. assistance is beneficial in this transition to a national autonomous office or prosecutor's office, and we need to support civil society organizations who are involved in criminal justice reforms, anti-corruption efforts, and human rights. While the Mexican government is responsible for strengthening the country's institutions to address Mexico's security crisis, the United States must also do its part. This should include more public health funding to address U.S. demand for illicit drugs and additional measures to combat arms trafficking to Mexico. I want to conclude by thanking the subcommittee for holding this hearing and for including a focus on the way to strengthen the rule of law in Mexico. For far too long, Mexico has been dramatically impacted by high rates of violence, corruption, human rights violations, and impunity, while transnational criminal organizations continue to traffic drugs and harm communities on both sides of the border. To reduce impunity, the Mexican government must work to create trustworthy, rights-respecting institutions. In this regard, as the U.S. Mexico cooperation moves forward, both governments should ensure that strengthening the rule of law is a centerpiece of these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Meyer. Mr. Miles, we'll hear now your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rooney, and members of the subcommittee. I would like to lay out 4 main points with respect to security in Mexico and U.S. security cooperation with Mexico. Point number 1, the 2008 Merida Initiative set out to reduce violence and the power of drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. It has failed to achieve those goals. As Dr. Shirk and Ms. Meyer indicated, 2019 was the most violent year on record. The strategy of capturing or killing high-value targets has not been sufficient to weaken the drug cartels, and by creating leadership vacuums, it has increased lethal violence over succession and territory. The cartels are still heavily involved in the narcotics trade, although the composition of that trade has changed. Less marijuana is coming across the border, but 90% of the heroin that comes in the United States comes from Mexico, and the country remains a major transit zone for cocaine. Increasingly, heroin is being supplanted by synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, with precursor chemicals coming from China arriving in Mexican ports on the Pacific. According to 2017 data from the CDC, 48,000 people in the United States died from opioids, including heroin, prescription, and non-prescription opioids. Point number 2, the Merida Initiative, despite its failure to rein in violence and drug trafficking, created a historic mechanism for security cooperation between Mexico and the United States that I believe is paying dividends. A wide array of technical training by U.S. experts continues to improve Mexico's institutional capabilities in confronting organized crime. Most importantly, Merida has made the Mexican government and its law enforcement agencies much more open to and accepting of U.S. advice and assistance. Several specific examples of the Merida Initiative's ongoing programs are a prison accreditation program that has resulted in 20 Mexican correctional facilities receiving international accreditation since 2011, a national vetting system that has identified corrupt officials within Mexican government agencies and military units, assessments, training, certification, accreditation, and equipment for forensic labs, training for prosecutors, investigators, and other justice sector personnel, and also training to professionalize Mexican federal, state, and municipal law enforcement agencies and to increase their capacity of their specialized investigative units. Apart from Merida, Mexico, with U.S. assistance, has expanded the use of financial intelligence units to identify, track, and if necessary, seize the assets of drug traffickers. This is an effective, nonviolent way to shut down the cartel's business model. Towards this end, in August of last year, Mexico strengthened its asset forfeiture law, a very positive step. The Merida Initiative also has created a framework for direct military-to-military training and cooperation. As an example, between 2001 and 2008, that is before the Merida Initiative was implemented, Mexican participation in U.S.-led military exercises consisted of just 2 exercises. Between 2009 and 2017, after Merida, the number surged to 46 joint exercises. Mexico, with U.S. help and equipment, also has taken steps to increase its maritime interdiction capabilities by beginning a program to add 8 long-range patrol vessels to its Navy. The first of these ships was launched in November 2018. These boats will enable the Mexicans to seize more Colombian cocaine shipments and Chinese precursor chemicals for fentanyl, deter illegal fishing vessels, and perform search and rescue missions up to 5,000 nautical miles from Mexico's coast. Point number 3 is that the Merida Initiative was conceived as a tool to support Mexico's own strategy, not as a substitute for it. Mexican and U.S. officials should work together to review what the Merida Initiative successfully achieved, what it did not, and help Mexico develop a new comprehensive strategy that takes into account new security threats such as violence and instability in Central America. The key is to work together as partners to fix what needs fixing and leverage the institutional relationships that we've built up over the last 12 years. That work has already begun. In two joint U.S. Mexico declarations from December 2018 and June 2019, the government of Mexico promised, among other things, a Mexican enforcement surge through the deployment of its National Guard, especially on its southern border, as well as a promise to cooperate with the United States to, quote, enhance security, governance, and economic prosperity in Central America. This included a commitment by the government of Mexico to invest $25 billion in its southern provinces. In early October of last year, Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, Kirsten Madison, led a delegation that met with senior Mexican officials to discuss ways to intensify efforts against the shared challenges of synthetic and other drugs, organized crime, and related violence. Finally, last month, the Attorney General Barr met with President Lopez Obrador and his team to discuss arms trafficking, money laundering, and international drug trafficking, and agreed to strengthen the bilateral high-level security group created last August. These commitments should be tracked and measured, and at the end of a comprehensive bilateral security review, the United States should provide the level of security cooperation funding that matches the severity of the threat Mexico continues to face both internally and from regional instability. My fourth and final point is stating the obvious. Mexico's security is linked to its prosperity. Its prosperity is directly related to U.S. policies on trade. I congratulate the House of Representatives on the passage of the USMCA Treaty, a huge step towards ensuring that Mexico remains on an upward path of economic development that will create better opportunities for its citizens and conditions for a safe and stable neighbor. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. We will now go to questions. I will start with the questioning and then the ranking member. Ever since, well, I've been now 13 years in this committee. 2008, I was one of the biggest supporters of the Mérida initiative. And we have appropriated about $3 billion worth of American dollars into this program. What should we change to make this program more effective? Can any, Mr. Miles?
Mr. Chairman, I think clearly the strategy has to change, and as I noted, that has already started. And as the other witnesses noted as well, it's really the long, hard, patient work of institution building, particularly in the criminal justice sector. I think our training with the prosecutors, with the defense side, with the prisons is starting to bear some fruit. It's not as fast as we would like, and it's not fast enough to reduce the corruption, or the violence that we've seen, but it is some progress. And I think the key thing is a partnership with the Mexicans, the investment that we've already put in over the 10, 12 years at the institutional level.
Anyone else?
Sorry, I would agree. I think it's one, looking at what you've called for, which is assessing what has or hasn't worked. I know there's been a real call to develop more indicators of progress. I think there's a real challenge, especially on training, and I think that's where we've trained thousands of police and prosecutors. How do you measure the impact of, has that training had any real difference in the way they operate? And so I think there's a real need to assess particularly the impact of U.S. training moving forward. And I think what Mr. Miles also referenced, accompanying prosecutors and really that more technical assistance, which takes a long time in terms of longer-term tool sets, but is where we could probably have more impact in terms of successful prosecutions in Mexico.
Thank you. Dr. Shirk? If I mispronounce your name, I apologize.
No, that's fine. You can call me Shrek. You can call me Shrek.
No, I don't want to call you
Whatever works. But I will just say, I think there's a lot of agreement among all of the witnesses. I do think that we have to evaluate what are the goals, what were the goals of the Mérida Initiative. I mean, on the one hand, we want to make Mexico more secure. We want to build the rule of law. We want security. And on that front, I agree that we have not achieved that. In that sense, the Mérida Initiative could be seen as a failure. But we also have the goals of institution building in Mexico and strengthening the capacity of the Mexican judicial sector. On that front, I think there has been real progress, as Dr. Mayer pointed out. And also, part of our goal has been to partner more effectively with Mexico to ensure cooperation between our two governments. And in that regard, the Merit Initiative has been a huge success across 3 U.S. presidential administrations, across 4 3 Mexican presidential administrations of different parties. And sustaining that cooperation has been, I think, one of the key successes. What I would certainly recommend and have recommended for some time is the need to really evaluate the kingpin strategy. There's no way we can allow people like Chapo Guzman to roam free. But at the same time, we have to be much smarter about the methods that we use to take them out. If you take out Chapo Guzman, but you don't take out his business partners, you don't take out the assets that he has placed in other areas, in the Mexican government and in the financial sector, it's not going to be an effective strategy, because the power vacuum that's created when you take out someone like Chapo Guzman is a major contributor to the violence we've seen recently.
Can you talk a little bit about President López Obrador? Has he fulfilled his campaign promise to take meaningful steps to combat corruption in Mexico?
I think López Obrador has a really important message of corruption, and he's certainly worked to curtail a bit government largesse, meaning that government officials that are taking advantage of public funds for their own benefit. I think what we haven't seen is real progress made on the national anti-corruption system itself. They have focused on a few high-level prosecutions. That's important. I mean, key people, and the budget for this year actually provides more money to the special prosecutor for corruption at the federal level, which is also important. But I think beyond that, we haven't seen a real strong signal that he supports the system as an institution, and that he wants to really ensure that throughout Mexico, meaning at the state level and the federal level, there's a real coordination of anti-corruption efforts. They have not named the 18 judges that are supposed to be part of the system to sanction grave cases of public corruption. They have cut funding for other parts of the anti-corruption system, and there's a real concern about public procurement processes in Mexico, which is one of the main sources of some of the bigger corruption scandals we've seen during the Peña Nieto administration. They've actually have even more funds that are basically used through the public procurement, and I think that's where there needs to be more oversight. I think there's a commitment there, at least in terms of discourse. What we really haven't seen yet is how he's going to make this new system, which was something pushed forward by civil society. The anti-corruption system was really a goal of an achievement of Mexican civil society, and we have not yet seen him really back that.
Thank you. My time is up. Ranking Member Rooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start maybe with a question for anybody, but I'd start with Dr. Shirk. Can you compare and contrast briefly the Calderon approach versus the Peña Nieto approach to dealing with these drugs and gangs and the violence? And then now, having had those two different approaches, how will AMLO's shift in strategy on fighting the cartels, this hugs over bullets business, affect the original mandate of the Merida Initiative?
I think President Calderon was very aggressive in his fight against the organized crime groups, and was particularly reliant on the kingpin strategy, targeting high-level operatives in Mexican organized crime. Unfortunately, evidently unbeknownst to President Calderon, his top drug fighter was on the take from the Sinaloa cartel, Genaro Garcia Luna. And how that affected the fight, I think, is something we're going to have to study more carefully. Peña Nieto came into office very skeptical of collaboration through the Merida Initiative, and initially wanted to greatly restrict efforts to work with the United States, but very quickly saw that there were opportunities to help address the real threat of organized crime, and we started to see that cooperation increase. López Obrador comes in with similar skepticism, and in fact announced that his government was going to no longer cooperate through the Merida Initiative, that the Merida Initiative was effectively canceled, until he realized both how grave the threat is and how vital U.S. assistance has been. And so I think that there is room for continued cooperation with the López Obrador administration. I am also very skeptical of the hugs, not gunfight slogan of this administration. But I understand that part of the rationale, part of the thinking behind that position is the deep skepticism that exists in Mexico about the efforts we've seen in previous administrations through the Kingpin administration. Kingpin strategy, and the desire to find some other approach that will work. I think we can find ways of working with this government.
Ms. Meyer, Mr. Miles?
I would just add that I think there's a gap in the policing strategy that has arisen from this consensus that the uniformed military needs to be pulled back from policing duties and that a National Guard needs to be stood up to accomplish that. That's had very mixed results, but at the same time, you've pulled back federal and state policing in those areas in which it's most needed. So the Mexican government at many levels has effectively lost control of some of that territory because it's not entirely clear from a policy view or organizational hierarchy who has responsibility now that the uniformed military has been pulled back from those duties, largely.
Well, in that respect then, oh, Ms. Meyer, do you have a comment?
I was just going to really briefly say, I think on that, in terms of the police and the National Guard, really looking at U.S. support on accountability. The U.S. has funded in the past the Internal Affairs Unit for the federal police, which has now been basically absorbed by the National Guard. And I think if you're looking at concerns on corruption within security forces or human rights violations, having strong internal affairs units is really important. So as the National Guard is being built up, that is an area where the U.S. could also be very effective. It's certainly a key aspect of López Obrador's security strategy is this National Guard, and so making sure that if you're deploying these forces, they're being held accountable for their actions.
Okay. Another question is, what can we do, bilateral steps the United States and Mexico could take to combat this flow of firearms crossing the border from the United States into Mexico?
One thing I think has been a very positive development in the last few months is the agreement between the Trump administration and the López Obrador administration to regularly revisit each month through a high-level strategic group the progress that's being made on firearms trafficking. That's something that's never happened before, and I think there's real potential for progress in monitoring what's going on. I do think that there are a number of things that hobble that kind of cooperation. I recommend, for example, greater transparency and access to information about the number of firearms that are being seized in Mexico, so we can better identify what are the origins of those firearms.
Anyone else?
I mean, I think there's a lot of issues in terms of how do you look at using universal background checks in the United States, classifying gun trafficking and straw purchases as federal crimes, things that would be more broad picture, requiring the reporting of multi-sales of long guns. And I think the last, which David referred to earlier in terms of legal gun sales, so increased oversight, because there is a lot of concern about seepage of even guns that are legally purchased by the Mexican government for their security forces that end up in the hands of criminal organizations. So are there ways that we could exercise more oversight over legal sales as well?
Thank you.
Congressman Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to each of our witnesses. I want to start by asking more about the National Guard. Apparently, about a third of the 60,000 or so new National Guard members that have been hired in the last year or so have been assigned to migration and immigration enforcement issues rather than addressing violent crime in Mexico. So I'd love your perspective on your perceptions of the current strategy, how much of their time and energies are being dedicated to each, and whether you think that is an effective use of the enhanced number of National Guard members. Perhaps we can start with you, Dr. Shirk.
Yeah, I think this is a real problem. The very first task with which the National Guard was directed was essentially order maintenance functions on Mexico's southern border. It's also, there are a number of flaws in the National Guard. The National Guard is not an investigative unit, doesn't have investigative capacity, is mainly, again, an order maintenance agency, and that doesn't help to get at this huge impunity problem, which Dr. Myers mentioned, that 90% of crimes essentially go unpunished in Mexico. So I think that there's potential to work with the National Guard. It's arguably, it's not even been a year that the National Guard has been enforced. But I am concerned that the National Guard has been essentially diverted from its main purpose, not only to address the migration situation, but it's also monitoring ports. It's doing all kinds of other things that it's not most urgently needed for.
Ms. Meyer?
I think there's currently about 12,000 National Guardsmen in southern Mexico, about 2,000 at the border. When we went down there in August to the Rio Suchiate, which is where a lot of border crossings, they looked pretty bored to me. I mean, I think there's a lot of need to really reassess, is this the best use of this new security force, given Mexico's own limited resources, and are there other agencies that could take on, particularly the immigration agency, more of that immigration enforcement role?
And when you ask that question, are there? I mean, can you help answer it? Are there?
Are there?
Other units or forces that can take on that responsibility?
There is the National Immigration Agency. That's their task. In the past, they have been supported for security reasons, sometimes with the federal police, but I think there is certainly a need to assess, can you grow your immigration agency? They had 5,000 members for the entire country, and so I think that's also where they've used these other forces as a stopgap measure because they haven't increased the size.
Okay.
And the second is just training. I mean, the National Guard is not trained to be interacting with vulnerable populations like migrants, and so like you really have the concern of what that could mean for asylum seekers and others.
I appreciate it. Mr. Miles, any comments?
I would just add that I would agree that National Guard has a very, very broad mandate, probably too broad, and can't do the policing functions that I think it's more intended to do. I would note, though, that given the drop in numbers that we've seen on southwest border due to a U.S. policy change, I think that policy change will, in effect, relieve the National Guard of having to do a lot of things that Lopez Obrador wanted to do. It forced these drops in migration, and that hopefully, if that trend continues, would allow them to do the sort of policing that was the original intent.
Okay, I appreciate it. My next question is relative to anti-corruption efforts, and we talk about it a lot, but rather than just hope for change, what can the U.S. Congress specifically do to provide incentives and resources, perhaps, to ensure that the effort is as robust as it can possibly be? Ms. Meyer, perhaps you could start.
I think
Specifics.
It's important. USAID has a pretty good transparency and area of work that's been working on, particularly at the state level. How do you work with the business community on their own obligations for compliance with anti-corruption efforts? How do you educate a broader population about what their role is in reporting corruption? They're also supporting the citizen participation committees, which are state and federal level committees that in the federal level actually have control over oversight for the entire system. And so I think there is a lot that USAID could do to strengthen those efforts. And the second would probably be more accompanying more cases and prosecutions and getting better skill sets to go after these cases. We have not seen any dismantling of corruption networks by this government. We have not seen yet a successful conviction. They still have some time to do that. But I think looking at, can there be ways of U.S. know-how to support their anti-corruption investigations?
Okay. We have about 30 seconds left, either Dr. Shirk or Mr. Miles, if you have.
I would just add that the United States is much more successful in its rate of prosecutions, and one thing that we can do is to target companies and individuals that are facilitating these criminal enterprises by prosecuting them here in the United States.
I appreciate that. All right, I yield back my time. Thank you.
Congressman Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you all being here. And Ms. Myers, I want to start with you. You were talking about, what we've been trying to do with foreign affairs or foreign aid and USAID and the Merida initiative. Did I say that right? I don't want to say that other word. With that initiative, we have put in $3 billion since 2008. Good governance, rule of law, decrease corruption, get rid of the drugs, and I think it's a dismal failure. I know there's some good things, and Mr. Miles, look forward to talking to you, because you said there are some good things that have come out of this. But I'm not seeing it here, and when I talk to my taxpayers, they're like, what are we doing? We have got to have a reset in this, and yet when the corruption is allegedly going up to the top, the reports of President Pena in the bribery scandal with El Chapo, that's an alleged, so we have to see if that follows through. But when you have that level of corruption at the very top, you can't have the rule of the law in your big cities, let alone your little cities. And those 42 people, the teachers and students that got killed, we knew what happened, but yet nobody comes clean on that. Nobody goes to jail on that. And so, and then you brought up, Ms. Myers, that less than 10% of the cases ever get reported, let alone tried. And so the people don't even come forward because they said it's a waste of time, and I'm sure it puts their life at risk. So when I look at the policies that we've had since, just go back to 2008, it's not working. We have to do something different. We've got this war on drugs, and Mexico's supposed to be with us, yet there's over 70,000 acres of heroin growing in Mexico. We know 90 to 95% of the heroin, the cocaine that comes into America transports via Mexico. It goes through their cartels. I mean, if this was a business model, we would be out of business. Nobody would lend you money for this business model. And what I propose is that this country needs to look at things differently. You know, Mr. Myers, you brought up, and I got a shout out to him because he's one of our constituents and he's here with his great wife, Phoebe, out here. Just a great family, and he's done a lot of work in this realm. You brought up that Mexico depends on trade, primarily with the U.S. We have the USMCA trade deal. I voted against it for some other reasons, but one of the things I brought up to the Mexican ambassador when she was here is the drugs transiting. If Mexico knows they're dependent on trade primarily with the U.S. and Canada, a weakened America is a weakened Mexico. And we know a lot of this drugs are coming up via the produce that comes in this or other things that are coming into this country. And so my proposal is we move from aid to trade, and we base that trade based on policies. When we have a country that aligns with us in rule of law, getting rid of corruption, and we've got our own problems here in this country, but when we start having countries align up with us philosophically in the rule of law so that we can work across the border, whether it's on the drugs, on the narco trafficking, the human trafficking, I don't think we should give them favored trade status. What's your thoughts on that? Anybody?
I don't think there's any scenario in my mind in which the Mexicans will be able to defeat these organizations on their own without U.S. training and assistance. So I think that always has to be a part of the policy answer.
Do they want to defeat them?
Well, in the Mexican presidential election, the top two issues were anti-corruption and violence. So there's clearly the political desire among the Mexican people to do this. Surprisingly enough, the United States, the Trump administration, migration were not top issues in the Mexican presidential campaign. It was reducing violence and anti-corruption.
Where's the anti-drugs in there?
Well, I mean, I think that's rolled up into the violence piece. I mean, when they say violence, it's the cartel violence. But again, we're talking about a country that has weak institutions, particularly at the local levels. And I think that's where we can actually make the contribution, is strengthening that institutional capability all the way down, not just the national government, state, local, all the way.
Well, and that's a frustrating thing because we put billions and billions and billions of dollars in there to strengthen those. They're not strengthened. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back. I appreciate your time. I look forward to talking to you afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Congressman Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just yesterday, international media reported the killing of Maria Guadalupe Esquivel, also known as La Catrina, who was a member of the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, responsible for the killing of 15 police officers last October. This 21-year-old sicaria, who at one point was reported to be a good student, was killed in an exchange of gunfire between the drug cartel and Mexican drug enforcement officers in the region of Tierra Caliente, Mexico. According to Inside Crime, back in the 1980s, 75% of the drugs seized in the United States came from the Caribbean. By 2010, the number went down to 10%, with 80% of the drugs seized coming from Mexico and Central America. However, there has been a significant shift in that model, with a significant increase and investment in the drug war in Central America and Mexico. The numbers have begun to shift back to the Caribbean. This is also fueled by the growing prominence and importance of Venezuela in the drug trade, only a few miles away from the Caribbean. Last December the 2nd, after escaping a raid in his residency in the Dominican Republic, Cesar Emilio Peralta, also known as El Abusador, was arrested in Cartagena, Colombia. Known to be the Pablo Escobar of the Caribbean, El Abusador today sits in a Colombia jail awaiting extradition to the United States. He trafficked thousands of kilos of cocaine that hit the streets in the United States, in my district, in the Northeast, in New York, New Jersey, Florida, New England states, all over the country, leading to, contributing to the opioid crisis that we now face in America. Yet, the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative only gets $58 million a year, a total of $600 million since implementation back in 2010, as compared to the $3 billion given to the Merida Initiative, or the $1.2 billion given to CARSI. What is your take on this shift, the potential shift of the drug trade going back to the Caribbean? Should we invest more in interdiction in the Caribbean and law enforcement in the Caribbean to combat the emergence of Venezuela and the shifting of the drug trade back to the way it was in the 1980s? To any one of you.
I think you point to a very important problem, this shifting networks. When enforcement is increased in one place, the flows move to another. We frequently refer to this as a game of whack-a-mole when we see these shifting networks. And I don't think we're quite there yet. Unfortunately, the flows of drugs through Mexico remains very robust, even as drug traffickers are fighting amongst themselves. I do, however, think that there should be more coordination between CARSI and the Merit Initiative, and a more united front to try to make sure that it's not as easy for those networks to shift from one region to another.
Anybody else on that?
I think just add that we do need to look more at the U.S. side of this in terms of billions of dollars have been invested in prevention, treatment, and recovery efforts, but a lot more still needs to be done. The U.S. lags far behind in terms of access to treatment and getting treatment centers to people in need in the United States, so particularly on the opioid crisis, but in looking at taking to scale harm reduction efforts in the United States. And so we can look at this sort of balloon effect, which is we're effective in one place and it moves somewhere else because there's also that demand in the U.S. And so looking at ways to really address demand in a more holistic way.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, let me just stress the interest that I have been seeing in a substantial increase in funding in the Caribbean Basin Initiative, and of course in working together with the Colombian Authority to extradite Cesar Peralta, el abusador. Thank you, and I yield back the returning part of my time.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the panel, thank you for being with us today. I want to focus my question particularly on drug cartels. Mr. Miles, you stated in your written testimony that cartels are heavily involved in the narcotics trade, that 90% of the heroin that comes in the United States comes from Mexico, and the country remains a major threat for cocaine. Increasingly, heroin is being supplanted by synthetic opioids such as fentanyl and precursors from China arriving in Mexican ports on the Pacific. And according to 2017 data from CDC, 48,000 people died in the United States from opioids, including heroin prescriptions and non-prescription opioids. I believe you would also agree that the Mexican drug cartels also play a major role in the exporting of methamphetamine into our country. Would that be correct, Mr. Miles?
Yes, based on the data I've seen. I would just add, I think we're probably in the midst of a huge transformation because of synthetics. There's already been some very interesting research that the decline of poppy production in Mexico is declining because of synthetic opioids. So, and these are things that can be produced anywhere, including the United States. So I think we're still trying to get a handle on exactly what that's doing to the drug trade.
But would you agree, Mr. Miles, that most of the street-level narcotics that we see today in America do actually come into our country by Mexican drug cartels across our southwest border?
Certainly on heroin and probably transit of most cocaine. I don't know what's happened to the marijuana market.
All right. And then, Ms. Myers, you, in your written testimony, talk a little bit about the fact that there are roughly 9 predominant drug organizations, 200 smaller-based organizations, that they are involved in things beyond drug trafficking that include extortion, pirated goods, kidnapping, oil theft, vehicle theft, human trafficking, and human smuggling. And then you go on to talk a little bit about the violent nature of these organizations. You say that roughly a third of the homicides in Mexico can be attributed to criminal drug organizations. You talk about a 33% increase in homicides since 2017. And would some of these homicides also include what we would refer to as political assassinations?
Yes, I mean, I think especially we saw that up to the elections for 2018, where there was an unprecedented number of mayors that were actually mayor candidates or local candidates that were killed. And so I think there is certainly a part of that violence that is related to organized criminal organizations going after local politicians or candidates.
And does violent activity generally go hand in hand with drug cartels and the way that they do business, particularly in Mexico?
Yes, I think the important thing that we're highlighting is that these drug cartels are no longer just drug trafficking organizations. We look at them as transnational criminal organizations because of their involvement in so many other illicit activities, including oil theft in Mexico, which is a really large priority for the current government, as well as all the other issues that you mentioned.
And also, we're seeing a continued increase in drug cartels and human trafficking and sex trafficking. Is that correct?
I think there's still the murky area of how much you have the human smuggling networks connected to the larger cartels. It's unquestionable that when they get to the U.S. Mexico border, small trafficking human smugglers are paying fees to these larger organizations, but whether I think there's still somewhat of a disconnect between the broader organized criminal organizations and then the groups that are working, particularly involving in human smuggling.
And then, Dr. Shirk, you talk in your testimony about the policy that Mexico had implemented for a number of years known as the Kingpin Strategy, that it was responsible for the takedown of El Chapo, cartel leader there in Mexico, but that Mexico has recently moved away from the Kingpin Strategy. And my question is, what alternative strategy has the Mexican government implemented in place of the Kingpin Strategy?
Effectively, the Mexican government has insisted that it will not target high-level operatives of criminal organizations because of the destabilizing effects that it has on the drug trade and the resulting power vacuums and violence that follow. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the right approach or right response. The problem with the Kingpin Strategy is that it only goes after the head of the Hydra and doesn't deal with the other component parts of these criminal organizations through more effective and broader prosecutorial investigations and prosecutions. So I think that the United States government needs to work very closely with Mexico and demonstrate that more effective prosecutions of the many component parts of a criminal enterprise can actually be effective in debilitating organized crime in Mexico, as it has worked in the United States really since the 1970s.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Congressman Gonzalez.
Thank you. I have a few questions. I'm going to ask Mr. Miles, to your knowledge, how are we measuring success to the Merida plan? I mean, $3 billion, what specific metrics are we using with the State Department to measure progress on our investment of $3 billion?
Well, one of the things we're doing is trying to see if any of the institution building is having an effect. And to take it as an example, the new criminal justice system as we're switching over to an entirely new system of oral prosecutions, there has been some measurement that the states that went earlier to that in Mexico have indeed seen higher conviction rates, more arrests.
How many states have gone into this new method?
All of them at this point, but it was phased in over roughly an 8-year period. So there were some that went right away and others that waited. The ones that went right away are starting to see positive results. They're small, but they are positive. That's one metric. I think another one is just sort of the professionalization, the level of professionalization we're starting to see in the law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies. If you talk to our officials on their counterparts, they all, to a man or woman, are testify to the professionalization of those forces that used to be very unreliable and mostly corrupt. Doesn't mean they're entirely not corrupt, but huge advances in those institutions.
Well, living on the border and traveling to Mexico all my life and doing business in Mexico as a lawyer before I ever came here, I see the Merida plan, I hate to say this, as a monumental failure in terms of if you do an economic cost-benefit analysis of, we've spent $3 billion, but yet I can't get in my car and drive 2 hours into Monterey without feeling like my life is in danger. And what more can we do in terms of, and what are we doing in terms of putting pressure that we have police that are actually not corrupt and making arrests, And then more than that, because there are a lot of arrests, they just all get let go because they pay bribes and get out of jail. How do we guarantee that they get prosecuted and that they actually go to prison and serve their jail time? What are we doing with this vast investment that we've made to assure that those institutions have accountability?
Just want to say that we need to think about this as a very complex problem. And yes, we've invested $3 billion over the last 10 years. We spend more than 10 times that every year on U.S. border security.
Yeah, I know that.
And so sometimes these complex problems don't go away just because you're spending billions of dollars, and they're problems that require much deeper interventions. But I will say that, there's not a lot I think that we can do to improve the overall integrity of Mexico's law enforcement institutions, as long as there is not professional compensation and merit-based promotion in Mexican police agencies and prosecutorial agencies. The sort of flip side of punishing corrupt individuals is making sure that honest individuals
Are compensated
properly and properly motivated and incentivized.
Right.
To do
What are we doing in that respect?
Well, in that regard, the Merit Initiative, I think, is absolutely key for the training component and also in helping to identify administrative regulations within police agencies and the fiscalias, the prosecutorial agencies, to help increase that professionalization. But we can only do so much. I think the Mexican government at all levels needs to be spending more on salaries and benefits and training and continued monitoring of all law enforcement personnel.
I agree. So are we doing any of that with the Merida initiative?
Yes, particularly I know through USAID, through INL.
What are they doing?
They're doing trainings of Mexican prosecutors and also coordination with U.S. prosecutorial agencies, groups like Western Attorneys CWAG, Center for Western Attorneys Generals, has spent 5 to 10 years working to coordinate between.
But still, more than 90% of people of criminals don't get prosecuted in Mexico.
That's true in especially places where the new criminal justice system is just taking root. But as Mr. Miles mentioned, the new criminal justice reforms, which we drove very heavily through the Merit Initiative and other USAID preceding the Merit Initiative, has been instrumental in improving the integrity of the criminal justice system and criminal procedure. One example, we did a study in December and found that in states that had made progress in the criminal justice reforms earlier, we saw a 5% reduction in the use of torture by law enforcement agents.
What states are those?
In states like Chihuahua, in states like Baja California, we've seen, even though there's been violence in those places, we're seeing more integrity in law enforcement. We can see small but important improvements in the integrity of policing.
Crime, from my point of view, seems like it's skyrocketed in Mexico. They've lost more people to violence in the last 2 years than we did in the entire war in Vietnam, soldiers in Vietnam. I mean, we couldn't stomach seeing body bags coming in this way. It's amazing that this is happening right next door, and we kind of sometimes look the other way here in the Congress.
It is horrific, and sometimes the doctors are to blame when their patients die. But sometimes there are other epidemiological factors that contribute to the violence, as we talked about earlier. We can make better doctors, better police in Mexico, but at a certain level, there are so many other factors that have contributed to this violence that we have to keep the overall trends in violence sometimes separate from the progress we're making on institution building.
So, so we see more than 90% of criminals not being prosecuted in Mexico, and you're saying it's improving in some states. What do you see in the next 10 years?
Can I think add on that, looking at the importance of what the federal government's doing, because that can be the model for what the states do in terms of reforms. The federal government dragged its feet a lot on the adversarial system, and that I think right now we're at a turning point because you have a national prosecutor's office. I think there's a lot the U.S. could do to engage with a new prosecutor's office and what are their priorities for criminal prosecutions, because you shouldn't just go after all crimes if you have limited resources. So how do you target your efforts on the more serious violent crimes? I think that's where the U.S. could be more effective and supportive. I think it was mentioned before, when you're looking at alternative
Specific areas,
to
right?
the federal government and looking at how they're transforming to this new prosecutor's office and looking at what their priorities are for criminal prosecutions. And the second is just on forensics. I think not every state in Mexico has a forensic lab. And of the forensic, they don't have ballistics, they don't have all the analytical capacity they need. So that's another area where if you don't have the ability to gather scientific evidence that's going to stand up in court, cases fall apart. The third would be policing. The police are like the last missing part of the criminal justice reform. They were the last to be prioritized in terms of training. Less than half of the police that are involved now in crime scene preservation have even any training on their roles in the new system. And so I think doubling down on how do we work to support Mexico's police in their new role in investigating crimes.
Thank you. Congressman Vargas?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for bringing this forward. I want to agree totally with and completely with my colleague from Florida when he stated, when you have corruption at the top, the very top, you don't have the rule of law. I think that was very appropriate, especially today. So thank you for those comments. Totally agree with them, completely. Drugs really is a symbiotic evil. The reality is that in the United States, we consume them and we pay a heavy price for that. A lot of our young people and even middle-aged people die because of illicit drugs. But the reality is that that same evil affects Latin America and Mexico too. It's interesting, Mexicans will tell you it's very easy to stop the drug trafficking, stop using them, because most of the drugs come to the United States. We love to point at Mexico and say, you know, why are you supplying these horrible drugs? The Mexicans saying, why are you consuming them? Because it's killing our people too. So we have to figure, it has to be a holistic strategy. And again, we're trying different things. I mean, the reality is in California, I think many people voted to legalize marijuana, not because they thought marijuana was a good thing, but to try to get the money out of it, the illicit money. And, you know, it's a strategy that I don't particularly like. However, I did vote to legalize marijuana for that reason. I thought maybe if we take the money out of it, that maybe, you know, kids won't use it as much and, you know, it won't be a gateway drug. And maybe we can get some of the deaths, the murder, and all this other mayhem out of there. So we'll see if that works. Now, I do have to ask about the new president in Mexico. Obviously, he has a different strategy than previous presidents, as you've been talking about. But his security plan, you know, the hugs versus you know, bullets or whatever, I don't have a lot of faith in that. And I'd like to ask Dr. Shirk, you first, because you said this thing is a many-headed thing, and you chop one off and it pops up. What about his strategy? Where are the gaps in his security? And I do agree with, by the way, the use of the National Guard. I think has been ridiculous when they're trying to stop a bunch of these poor people from coming up. They don't have the drugs. They're not selling drugs. They're not killing anybody. But he uses most of the money for the National Guard to stop these people from migrating. But anyway, if you could talk about where you think the gaps are in his security policy.
So, first of all, thank you. You are my congressman, so I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you as a professor from the University of San Diego. I would say, you know,
Take all the time you'd like.
The Lopez Obrador, thank you. The Lopez Obrador administration is focused on trying to, for example, deal with the roughly 2.6 million Mexicans that are neither young people who are neither enrolled in school nor employed. By giving them scholarships and internships. He's tried to address the problem of crime and violence by creating a new public security secretariat. He's created the National Guard, and he's created this new fiscal prosecutorial mechanism. These look really good on paper. Each of these elements, or each of these changes, I think, potentially has merit. Unfortunately, it all comes down to the implementation. And giving $200 scholarships to tens of thousands of Mexican students doesn't really get to the most violent actors. for example. And so I'm a little bit dubious about the long-term benefit of his scholarship initiative. When it comes to the Public Security Secretariat, what's very clear is that the new National Guard is nominally reporting to the new Public Secretariat, Security Secretariat, but it's effectively an outgrowth of the Mexican military and lacks some of the important accountability mechanisms that we would expect for law enforcement. And lastly, the new Fiscalia is still really trying to build this agency while the car's in motion. And so I think we've seen very few results so far from the administration. I think it's very distressing to the Mexican public, the idea of simply—
And I'm going to stop you just for one
Yes,
second
sir.
because I'm running out of time, but I do want to ask you about extradition and prosecution in the United States. It doesn't seem like he's very much in favor of that either.
No, I would agree with that.
So that I think is going to be a big problem. Do you suspect that's going to be a big problem too? Because there is always that fear. I think the drug traffickers have that fear that they're going to be extradited to the United States and they won't be able to escape here. And I don't think he's very anxious to extradite anybody.
I think we'll see fewer extraditions over the next 5 years remaining in his administration than we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years through other administrations.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you. Congressman Castro?
Thank you, Chairman. As we speak, hundreds of people from Central America seeking refuge at our borders are forced to wait in Mexico as their asylum claims are processed. Tomorrow, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus will be visiting some of these folks in Brownsville and later in Matamoros, Mexico. These individuals and families are subject to gang violence, extortion, and crime when waiting at the border. Can you tell us what the conditions are in Mexican border cities where these asylum seekers are having to remain because of the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy?
I think the conditions are very dire in the majority of the cities. We have seen, particularly in Laredo, Matamoros, tent cities that are stood up, I think in part because when the Mexican government also accepted the expansion of this program, they did very little on their side of the border to ensure that they had the public services they needed. So you have lots of people living on the streets in very precarious situations, and as you mentioned, victims of crime. And so I think that's the key issue is we have seen migrants kidnapped in Mexico historically. For over a decade, migrants have been targeted by criminal organizations at the border, and yet it continues in part because, as we've mentioned, there is very little investigations into these crimes in Mexico.
In many of these Mexican cities, the U.S. government has advised Americans not to travel to. But my follow-up question to that is not in this case about the American government. We know what the Trump administration is doing. AMLO ran as a reformer for president of Mexico, but there have been reports about his possible complicity with the Trump administration in perhaps abusing the human rights of some of these asylum seekers and making their path harder, not in a just way, but perhaps in an unjust way. Can any of you speak to that?
I think there's twofold here. One, we would certainly view as a human rights organization the migrant protection protocols in that program is inhumane and should be ended because of the impact it has on the safety of asylum seekers and their ability to get protection in the United States, including processing their cases and having legal assistance. I think the Mexican government's own detention strategy has likely deported back to the dangerous situations people are fleeing from because they don't adequately screen people when they're apprehended in Mexico. That said, there were 70,000 asylum requests in Mexico last year, and they are certainly working to expand their own capacity to protect people. So I think they certainly have a responsibility ensuring that people that want protection have the opportunity to request it, but they haven't done nearly enough in this area.
On a different subject, a significant contributor to gang violence and cartel violence in Mexico is the export, both authorized and unauthorized, of small arms bought in the United States and taken to Mexico or exported to Mexico. In your estimation, what can the United States do to prevent small arms, including assault weapons, bought in the United States from being sent to Mexico to be used by cartels and organized crime?
Well, I think in my written testimony, I suggested, for example, a ban on the import of assault weapons to the United States, which make their way into the Mexican marketplace, is one good place to start. I also think that our efforts to increase The capacity for ATF and other agencies to investigate straw purchases is greatly needed. We need it would be nice to have a registration requirement for large volume ammunition purchases and unassembled assault weapon kit imports. There are, I think, many things that we can do and they have been on the table for a very long period of time. What I'm encouraged by is that in the last few months we've seen the United States and Mexico set up a commission, a binational commission to address those issues. And I think it would be very valuable for this committee to monitor actively the progress that's being made through those binational dialogues.
Any other remarks on that question? And there was a comment made earlier about the amount of drugs that come from Mexico. But I think as we think about that fact, we also have to consider the fact that the United States is right now is spending billions of dollars on a border wall, billions of dollars on border security in a way that is not necessarily dealing with the customs, with the things that come in or slip in, and the fact that a fraction of the vehicles, for example, that come through the U.S. Mexico border are actually properly and fully inspected. I think for the United States Congress, for the President, I think it's something that we have to think about in terms of how we dedicate our own resources. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We're going to have a second round, if you don't mind, of questioning. I'll let the ranking member start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miles, in your testimony, you mentioned these financial intelligence units to track and identify and if necessary, seize drug traffickers' assets. And I know a lot of people have been interested in our ability through the Treasury Department, et cetera, to identify and track those kind of assets just like we do in other parts of the world. And I'd be interested in your thought of how effective that kingpin designation and the seizing of U.S. assets of cartel members is, and what else we might do better, and also how effective this new Mexican law to sequester assets in Mexico might be as well, and how we might be able to help them do a better job with that.
I think this is one area in which the United States could make a lot of progress with Mexico. There's certainly the willingness there, and we have developed very sophisticated tools, partly as separately as part of the war on terror, with financial tracking and seizing, and there's definitely political willingness on the Mexican side. What is missing, as you said, is the technical capacity. Right now, I think the Treasury Attaché's office of the U.S. Embassy in Mexico is very thinly staffed, and this is really activities the Treasury Department
So
needs.
kind of compare it to the one in Luxembourg that's like 100 people.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's less, it's single digits at Mexico City. But this is an area in which, it's nonviolent, it's very effective, and it gets the cartel's attention very, very quickly. So in regards to the kingpin strategy, if that's what it means, I think that's a good idea. Snatch and grab missions, I think, as we've talked about, have not been effective.
Thank you. Any other comments about this?
I would just add that one thing that's sorely lacking in Mexico are witness protections and whistleblower protections. If we really want to identify corruption, if we want to identify where those assets are, having stronger whistleblower protections and having stronger witness protection would be a great way of getting lower-level operatives of a criminal enterprise to help identify where those assets might lie or where funds are being diverted. Unfortunately, there are no real examples of successful prosecutions using witnesses that have been turned essentially from criminal organizations in Mexico in the way that our prosecutorial agencies are able to do, because no one feels safe to do that.
Thank you. I yield my time.
Congressman Gonzalez.
Thank you. Just in follow-up, one last issue that I wanted to discuss, and I guess, Mr. Miles, I'm sorry to pick on you, but you seem to have the background for the questions that I have. So what are we doing, or what should we be doing to secure, and I'm talking about security along with trade, to secure our trade routes? In the small city of McAllen, which is the southern portion of my congressional district, we get about $1 billion a year of legitimate Mexican deposits into our banking institutions. This year, by I think it was October, we had over $1 billion of retail sales to Mexican nationals who come and shop and own second homes, either in South Texas or Padre Island, somewhere in South Texas. So they've been great business partners and clients and customers. What are we doing to assure those trade routes stay safe? And the reason I ask is I hear of 18-wheelers being pulled over and extorted for, depending what product they're bringing through and depending what's hot at the time. Tourism is even though it's high, it's been impacted because people from Monterey, which is the biggest city where most people come and shop and own second homes, don't come as much anymore, are selling their second homes on Padre Island and in South Texas because of those routes being so dangerous. And I think it has a direct economic impact, and I'm curious what can we do? I've been down there. I've met with Secretary Durazo about trying to secure Highway 40, and I've talked to the officials. They've sent people down there recently, and they tell me it's better, but we should be securing our trade routes. In fact, I thought that should have been part of the USMCA, which I was very proud to vote for, but I thought it was missing a security component to assure that our trade and business is also safe and tourism is safe when they travel, especially on those main thoroughways to ports of entry.
Well, I think without a doubt, number one, investing in border infrastructure, and particularly on the security side, is critical, and this is something that you've probably heard quite a bit. Using better technologies to do those inspections at the border so that we have much higher confidence. Two, I think intelligence sharing has also been one of the bright spots in the U.S. Mexico security relationship. I think that needs to be expanded to include, as you said, those routes coming in on the trade side, not just, for instance, on the in areas of the border in which there's no security. Right. And then maybe something like what we similarly do in airports outside the United States, where we do sort of pre-checks using U.S. personnel or at least U.S. assistants, do something like that.
On the other side of the border?
On the other side, with Mexican cooperation.
That would be great. I would love to see that.
And these are all tools, I think, that would make a dent.
I envision like safe zones, like maybe I know people don't want to hear the green zone as an example, but having a trade route, having it completely secured from the port of entry to, say, Monterey or whatever the major city hub is where the trade is happening, that they could have either military or some kind of security every so many miles to completely shield trade and tourism through those routes. And it doesn't seem like that it should be that complicated to do, but I could assure you that it's having a huge economic impact, and there's a price tag to that insecurity that we don't seem to talk much about, and we didn't really get into that thoroughly during the USMCA. I felt that it was rushed without having that security component. But whatever opinions you guys want to share on that idea, I'd be happy to listen.
I think Mexican security experts have brought forward that idea several times of are there areas where the Mexican government should be looking at securing highways, particularly for these high-trafficked areas. I'm not sure with the López Obrador administration how far they've gone with those discussions. I would caution, though, I think the other kind of missing part of that is looking at corruption within the security forces. So putting up checkpoints is important, but making sure that the people manning the checkpoints are working on the right side of it. And so I think it goes back to we need to ensure that Mexico has really strong accountability.
Right. So we need to work, we need to like find ways to be there, right, in those trade routes.
And work with them on
right.
these controls over the security forces.
So is that going to happen?
I think it should be part of the discussions in terms of future cooperation. How can we really work much more on these?
What can we do as members of Congress to be helpful with that idea?
I would say raise it in questions report language for appropriations, raise it with Mexican officials in terms of their security policies, how much they're looking at security in the highways as an issue. Certainly you have dialogue with Mexican officials, and I think the other is talking to State Department in terms of what their priorities are going to be in raising these issues. That we want to make sure that there are security forces that are securing areas but also working on the right side.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Yoho?
Thank you, sir. Mr. Gonzalez, we have a bill that we're putting together to do just that on the supply chain of stuff coming in. And so I'll have my office reach out to you, and I appreciate your attention on that. I got to respond to my good colleague from San Diego talking about corruption. I don't believe after 3 years of investigation that was part of the articles that got sent over there to correct the record. What percent of the drug and human trafficking or illicit business, that money, what percent of the GDP of Mexico does that account for? Does anybody have an estimate? Dr. Shirk?
it's a very, Mexico has a roughly $15 trillion economy. And estimates of drug revenues and other illicit revenues range widely between about 6 and as high as $40 billion a year. So if you do the math on that, you're talking about a fraction of a percent of the total Mexican GDP.
Okay. I heard a higher number, and and I think that goes back to why this is such a hard thing to get rid of. And I thought you brought. Go ahead.
I apologize. I said 14 trillion. I meant 1.5 trillion dollars.
1.5 trillion, yeah. And so it's a significant amount of money. I mean, nobody's going to walk away from that. The idea of incentivizing, the officials, whether it's law enforcement, court officials, or whoever in the legal system, to incentivize them, I think is a good thing. But then there's always somebody coming by on the other side going to offer them a little bit more money or threaten their family. And we saw this in the cocaine growing regions in Colombia and Peru, to move the cocaine farmers into coca or another product. Well, the drug traffickers come back and say, no, you're going to grow this one. And they may pay them a little bit more, but they also become more violent and threaten those. So I think we need to look into this, differently as far as the percentage of the GDP of that country. And then we also know that a lot of that money is in the black economy, so it's never reported. And we also know that a lot of that money is coming into our country via produce or other things. Dr. Shirk, you brought up some ideas on getting the amount of guns going down there under control. So I assume you have an idea what percentage of guns go down there from the United States versus from South or Central America, or seepage from the military or police down there. What percent do the guns coming out of the United States account for in your estimate?
So we don't have very good data on that, frankly. When ATF does firearm searches for Mexico, they're only searching the firearms that Mexico presents as potential searchable firearms, so they're most likely U.S. firearms. The percentage then of total identified firearms that come from the United States that ATF has looked at is somewhere between 70 and 80%. But that's not necessarily a great reflection because we don't know. ATF doesn't trace firearms that may have come from Central America or other places. I will just say that on the percent of GDP question, I completely agree with you that if it's $6 billion, it's still a lot of money, even if it's not a large percentage of the Mexican economy.
Right.
$6 billion will buy you a lot of political science professors, for example, or police officers or other government officials. So getting at the corruption issue, as I said before, really requires us to see professionalization of law enforcement in Mexico.
And I agree with that, but that has to go back to rule of law, and have all those things set up, those institutions. I'm going to put out a word of caution before you start recommending how we should do gun control or monitoring things in this country. We should get a handle on that so that we can talk from that perspective and just saying it's America's fault, we need to have a gun registry, which I don't think that's a good way to go. Other than that, I mean, we see this problem. It's something we need to get under control. Mr. Miles, you've been down there a long time, and I look forward to talking to you more when we're in the district. But this is something that it's a cancer on a society. Government or countries can't perform to their ultimate goal and reach their full potential when you have all this corruption around you, when you have all these threats around you. And of course, we see it here in this country. We have certain cities and certain areas that are just terrible, and we've got to get this under control. And it's going to be all of us working together. And if we're all on the same team, as I shared with the Mexican ambassador, a strong America is a strong Mexico. A weakened America is a weakened Mexico. So we are all in this together. I yield back.
Thank you. Congressman Vargas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just to amplify the record, I don't think President Nieto was convicted of any corruption crime either or impeached. One of the things that is interesting about living along the border is the irony of having one of the safest cities in the United States, certainly safest large cities, in San Diego. So if you want to come to a safe place, come to San Diego. And you simply cross the border and then you go to probably the most dangerous city in the world. And that's the irony of the border. The other irony would be that if you decided to check every car that passed that border every day, the economic damage that you would do to San Diego and to Tijuana would be catastrophic. We rely on, it's interesting, in fact, San Ysidro Chamber of Commerce, which is right on the border, did a study and showed that most recently, the highest increase of daily crossers are actually American citizens that are now living in Tijuana because the rents are cheaper, their homes are less expensive, and they've decided to move now and to live in Tijuana and work in San Diego. So we do have a great relationship there, but the irony, again, is the level of violence that you have. And it's not an easy question. I mean, that's why I get so frustrated because, there's lots of things that we've been trying, and I'm not sure that this new president, what he's trying is going to work. In fact, I've been somewhat disappointed, and that's why I asked, his focus on corruption has been great, but what about the notion that these drug traffickers have literally brought incredible levels of violence, and he doesn't seem to address it, or he doesn't seem, even with the massacres that have happened, he seems to have put this off on the back burner. Could you comment about that? It seems like you want to comment. Go ahead. But put your microphone on so I can hear you.
Yeah, I think one of the big differences is that in Mexico, there are very little consequences when you kill somebody. And I think if you can kill because you can, and the odds of you actually getting investigated and prosecuted are so low, there's very little disincentive for those type of crimes. And so that goes back to the institutions in Mexico. And one is effective policing. So how do you police that people actually trust? And that they're the first person you're going to go to when you get robbed, instead of maybe thinking they're part of the problem, and not having criminal justice systems where you have prosecutors that can gather scientific evidence that stands up in court. And so I think it's a long-term issue. We've talked about what should be done in Mexico. Experts estimate it's going to take about 10 more years for the criminal justice reforms to be fully effective in the country. But I think it goes back to that's the big difference.
So are you hopeful then that is going to happen? Do you believe that's going to happen? Is that your conclusion?
I'm hopeful that you'll see more progress on the state levels in terms of these reforms. I think with the federal government, López Obrador has not given really clear signs of his commitment to strengthening the institutions he needs, and we'll have to see what that might evolve into this coming year.
Would anyone else like to comment on that? Because I do want to hear some hope. I mean, we've heard all the negative things, and it seems the crime has gotten worse, but is there hope out there?
I think one macro change is this demand for accountability by the Mexican public, and this is something relatively new. And it's not just in Mexico; you've seen it across the region. But you've seen one very brave journalist and also several very brave NGOs that are essentially they're breaking these major cases on anti-corruption. And it's reflecting this desire and demand by the Mexican public to hold their officials accountable. There's still a lot of work to be done before we get there, but the public in Mexico and Brazil and other countries are now saying we're not going to put up with governments who simply ignore or kick the can down the road. So I think that to the extent that we can work and keep attention on those civil society, journalists, and public institutions, force accountability into that system.
Mm-hmm. Doctor?
I would just add that the Merit Initiative helps support those civil society organizations. Groups like Mexico Evalúa, groups like the World Justice Project, which is based here in the United States, but has a program monitoring and evaluating justice reform in Mexico, are helping to fuel what has been the largest wave of increase in the number of civil society organizations in the last 100 years in Mexico. We've seen a proliferation of organizations focused on justice sector improvements, anti-corruption, and other accountability mechanisms. So that's something that this committee and our government can definitely do to help.
Well, I'm still hopeful, and I want to say that we worked with Colombia, and certainly the situation got a lot better there. And I hope that in Mexico it does too, and I'm certainly willing to work with anybody that wants to do that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We spoke a few minutes ago about the 9 major drug trafficking organizations and roughly the 200 smaller organizations that are involved in illicit activity, including narcotics trafficking, extortion, pirated goods, kidnapping, oil theft, vehicle theft, human trafficking, and human smuggling. We also spoke that roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of all homicides can be attributed to organized crimes, and that some of those homicides do include political assassinations. Last year, it was reported that the administration was contemplating designating Mexican drug cartels as foreign terror organizations. My question is, one, would you support this designation, and why or why not? So, Dr. Shirk, I'll start with you.
I would not, most importantly because I would not want to see our valuable counterterrorist resources diverted to address what is effectively a law enforcement and organized crime problem, particularly when I do think that we have very strong mechanisms already available to us in order to go after their financial assets, in order to prosecute those individuals involved in drug trafficking on the U.S. side of the border. That, to me, is our resources, I think, are correctly allocated. The problem is the lack of capacity and the lack of integrity in Mexican judicial sector institutions that allows for these high levels of impunity. So I would just say that I would not support that designation.
Ms. Myers?
I also would not support it, I think, because in one part, you're looking at criminal organizations that are widely profit-driven and are looking more at earning money, and there's not a big looking for social ideological transformation in New Mexico. And so even with the political co-optation, it's more to have control over routes than trying to impose a different political or social model over a society. And I think the other is the impact it would have on U.S. Mexico relations and perhaps impact future cooperation on security, on migration, and a lot of other areas. And so I think there's a lot of other tools that the U.S. already has in its disposal, and looking at organized criminal organizations, the kingpin designation, et cetera, that we should pursue more than looking at a foreign terrorist organization designation.
And Mr. Miles?
I would expand on that point. I think an FTO designation would be counterproductive for two reasons. One is, as Ms. Meyer already mentioned, my reading of the legislation for FTO designation is that there has to be an ideological component present, not just a threat to the United States, but the ones that are currently on the list, they're either Islamic terror groups or Marxist or national separatists. I don't know how you'd get there to make the argument that cartels have an ideological component, and I think it would probably get challenged in court and tie that up. But number two, more importantly, I think anything that smacks of a desire to do unilateral action, whether it's enforcement or targeting by the United States and Mexico, I think would set us back decades in terms of our cooperation, the relationships that we've built with the intelligence and the law enforcement agencies. So if they interpreted an FTO designation as a green light or permission slip from the administration to go in unilaterally, I think that would seriously damage our interests.
Would each of you agree, and if you don't, please let me know, that the tools that we currently have at our disposal and the strategies that we have implemented have failed to adequately control the drug trafficking organizations in Mexico?
As I mentioned in my remarks, if we're measuring the level of violence and the involvement in drug trafficking, we have failed to achieve that objective, absolutely. It doesn't mean Merida didn't accomplish other things, which I believe it did. That objective clearly was not met.
Ms. Myers?
I think I would agree in terms of looking at violence in Mexico. If we're looking at it more on how do we expand the relationship between the countries, build trust, and create those institutions, I think the Merida Initiative has certainly made progress in those areas.
And Dr. Shirk?
I would agree with those statements. I would, just going back to this terrorism point, I mean, in many ways, drug trafficking organizations are worse than ideological terrorists in the sense that they're killing for money, and they're killing 8-month-old babies, and they're drowning people in or mutilating their bodies in horrible ways. And so I think we tend to look at the acts that they commit as terrible and horrifying, and we want to condemn them. But I think that there are smarter ways that we can go about fighting these organizations.
And Dr. Shirk, just to follow up on that, based upon what you just said, shouldn't we use every tool in our disposal to fight drug trafficking organizations to make sure that, one, that violence does not come to our shores, and then two, to try to help our friends in Mexico as they are continuing this battle which has raged in their country now for decades?
I have sometimes problems with my cell phone, but I wouldn't use a hammer.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here today. As our witnesses have explained, the challenge of insecurity in Mexico is immense. I plan to work with my colleagues in the coming months to further evaluate our assistance to Mexico and find ways to improve our strategy going forward. I thank the witnesses and all members for being here today. With that, the committee is adjourned.